One of the most dynamic openings I've found to play for black is, of course, when you're a young boy, you fall in love with the Sicilian Dragon. However, the mainline dragon, players like Karpov would play the Yugoslav attack, and someone once asked Fischer, what about the dragon? And he said, oh, you just play the Yugoslav attack and rip open the H-file, check, check, and mate. So he was very dismissive. Now, when it came to chess, one should listen to Fischer. He quite often had very deep insight, very deep understanding, and really knew what he was talking about. However, with the accelerated dragon, quite often, by saving the tempo and not advancing your pawn to d6 right away, you get opportunities to slam the pawn into d5 and obtain instant equality. Or, if white goes for one of the quieter setups, then you can opt to go for d6 and go for a normal dragon setup where you have not allowed the Yugoslav attack. And it creates a strategic imbalance. White might gain more space in the center, but black will get counterplay down the open c-file and has an extra center pawn. And so when I was looking for an opening to play against lower-rated players or players in situations where I needed to win a game, to me, the accelerated dragon totally fits the bill. And so in Chapter 1, we're going to look at all the various 6th and 7th move alternatives where they play moves like f3 and queen d2, or they try to play knight takes c6 on one of the early deviations. And so we're going to do a bit of an update there, and primarily I'm going to focus on games and experience that myself and my students have had. I think you'll find this very, very instructional, because this is what you actually meet when you're playing your opening out there in the internet streets. There are people that will come at you with crazy things, and you need to be ready to meet them. And that's what we're going to look at in Chapter 1 of the Accelerated Dragon. The first game we will look at from our pioneer in the Dragon Sicilian is Alexander Fritz versus Simon Winnower from Wiesbaden, 1880. Pretty standard move order so far. However, an early knight f6, and now g6. Bishop e2, bishop g7, and here, instead of just castles with a normal accelerated dragon, he plays d6. So this is more like a classical regular dragon, which sometimes we will transpose into queen d2, and here h5. Apparently after queen d2, setting up the battery, he was very afraid of the bishop h6 idea, so he played h5. h3, bishop d7, f4, queen a5, and then a3 question mark. Knight takes c4. A typical combination that every accelerated dragon player needs to be aware of. We've won many games, my students and I, with this tactical motif. This seems to be the first example, though, of this sacrifice. Knight takes, and then the brilliant queen takes c3. This is absolutely the first time I've seen this tactical shot appear, and it will be critical in our anti-Yugoslav 7 queen a5 variation. Note that bishop takes c6 would be a mistake because knight takes c4, and you have queen on queen, so you don't have time to recoup the knight on e4. And after queen takes, knight takes, yeah, you might grab a pawn or two, say bishop b2, rook a2, but still, the knight should be worth more. But after knight c6, the beautiful queen takes c3 solves black tactical problems, leaving pawns ahead. After queen takes c3, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, and here, black should play bishop takes c6, keeping the white pawns doubled on the c-file, keeping the file half open, keeping a pawn on b7. Clear advantage for black. Instead, he played b takes c6. And after bishop f3, knight g3, rook g1, knight f5, bishop f2, knight g7, White actually had some compensation for his pawn. Rook to b1. Now he brings the knight on over and guards the b7 square. Again, not clear why he didn't take the pawn on f4. Rook b4, castles, rook over. Now penetration with play against the a7 pawn. And then rook behind the pawn. Emanuel goes knight c6, offering to trade rooks. And after bishop takes, recoups the pawn on a7. We've now reached a rook and bishop versus rook and bishop of opposite color ending, where black definitely has the healthier pawn structure, but white does have an outside passed a pawn. Bishop takes g2 and h4. So black has an extra pawn, superior structure. f6, king up, king up, king up. And now here he offers to trade rooks, which I'm not sure that's the best idea. However, after the rook trade, white, very discouraged, resigned, maybe a bit prematurely. So it is true he lacks counterplay, and black is clearly better, but white could still play on. The computer gives an equivalent of 1 point material edge for black. However, this game is noteworthy for the combination queen sack, knight takes c6, queen takes c3, a very important tactical variation we need to be familiar with. The second game from our Dragon Sicilian Pioneer is Arnold Schottlaender versus Simon Winnower, also from Wiesbaden, 1880. Let's take a look. And now d6. Of course, knight f6 would be our standard accelerated move order, but d6, bishop e2, bishop d7, and again, he had a preference for this early h5. h3, knight out, f4, queen a5, knight back, and I have to say white played this game pretty well for quite a while, I thought. Castles, castles, and here, with black, I might be concerned about white castling queenside and then blasting away with pawn to g4. But anyway, white castled, and now rook at 8 at e8, maybe overplaying it a bit. Here, for example, maybe a6, maybe knight a5, a couple ideas that come to mind. Rook at 8 e8, rook a d1, bishop c8, rook at f to e1. Black would have been under pressure if white had played knight d5, but rook at f to e1, king h8, king h1, and now a little bit too passive for my taste here with knight back to g8. Although, keeping in mind that William Steinitz was the world champion at that time. Knight to b5, exclamation point. Using the tempo against the queen, after she goes back, white should have now played c4, really establishing a very nice Roxy bind type structure with a bit of a clamp down on the black position. However, instead, after queen b8, queen f2, a6, knight back, bishop d7, and white still enjoys a nice spatial advantage. c3, rook d8, rook d2, queen c8, and now g4. In my view, that was kind of an unnecessary loosening of the white king position. But after g4, knight f6, white should now play g takes h5 with some kingside attacking chances. Instead, rook to g1 happened. But then, Winnower very astutely played e5, gaining counterplay. After knight takes, bishop takes, he's got two hits on the e4 pawn. f5, and then knight takes e4 with a fork on the rook and the queen, forces white to give up the bishop. Bishop takes check, and then g takes f5. Excellent play. After bishop b6, f takes g4, h takes g4, and then rook d7. White recouped a pawn by taking on h5, but then f5 with a clear advantage for black. He's got the pawn center, and he's got the beautiful bishop pair versus the unimpressive white bishop and knight. Play continued with rook to g6, f4, unleashing a kind of discovered attack on the rook. Rook takes on d6, rook takes, and queen g4, basically ending the game. King safety becoming the priority, and white resigned. It is in fact mate in 12, but a typical variation would be queen g4, h6, attacking the bishop, and then simply check and mate. The first in a series of historical games by the second world champion will be David Graham Baird versus Emanuel Lasker, and this was played in New York, 1892. We'll just kind of go through this game a little bit quick so you get the essence. Interesting, d takes c6, allowing the endgame after queen takes, king takes. The next game from our Emanuel Lasker series in the Dragon Sicilian is against John Washington Baird, also from New York, 1892. Let's take a quick look. c3, a bit dubious. Of course, c4, going from Roxy Bind, that might make sense, but then queen b6 would be excellent counterplay. Therefore, probably the most normal move would have been knight to c3, not pawn to c3. Well, Lasker goes ahead and plays d5, the standard frame move, and after knight takes, pawn takes, e5, f6, chipping away at the white center. So now black already has pretty comfortable equality, at least. Counterplay down the b file, and now an interesting series of exchanges takes place. Knight up hits the bishop on e3, bishop back, and then bishop takes, queen takes, and a surprising decision is that he takes the knight. But his idea here is that he wants to play on the light squares. After queen e8, white avoids the trade of queens, but then queen up hits the rook on b1. Bishop out, and then the amazing e5 pawn sacrifice. Well, here white should consider playing fe5, and then after queen c2, rook over, rook down, and black is slightly better. But in the game, after e5, white played d takes e5. But then after queen c2, attacking the pinned bishop, rook at f to d1, and the shot, rook takes f4, based on the pin. Now, after the retreat, queen e1, rook e4, and Dr. Lasker has a crushing attack. After queen f2, the other rook came into play, and on queen c5, pinning the knight, so the bishop wouldn't go lost, the powerful penetrating rook to e2. Now the d2 bishop and the g2 pawn are both under fire. We can see Dr. Lasker has his important pieces penetrating on the light squares, because white does not have a light squared bishop or knight to run him away with. So in the game, after rook e2, rook f1. But then the absolutely brilliant rook at e to f2. Talk about in your face. Well, white played e6. But of course, if rook takes f2, you take the guy on b1, and then check, and then back rank mate. So after rook at f2, white shoved his e-pawn forward, but then came rook f1, rook f1, rook f1 check, and white resigned. The point being that after rook f1 check, king takes f1, bam, knight takes d2, check to the king, discovered attack on the queen, game over. Beautiful example of combining strategy with tactics by the second world champion, Emanuel Lasker. The next game in our series that we're looking at with the second world champion, Emanuel Lasker, was Alfred K. Robinson versus Dr. Lasker, Philadelphia, 1892. Let's take a quick look. The early knight takes c6. I'm not a big believer in the knight takes c6 for white unless he has a concrete follow-up plan, but still, a lot of players do it to release the tension. However, after b takes c6, black does get an extra center pawn. Bishop d2, d6, bishop c4, knight out, castles, castle, king h1, and then d5. Instant equality, seizing the initiative, taking advantage of white's somewhat innocuous play. After pawn takes, bishop to b3, and now Dr. Lasker gives us an exquisite lesson in how to use the initiative. Bam, d4, driving the knight from c3. Knight goes back. Bishop a6, pinning the knight. f3, e5, securing the center. Bishop g5, kicks that guy, gains more space, and then boom, knight to d5, threatening penetration to e3. This encourages black to give up the bishop pair. And what a pair of beautiful bishops they are. After rook e1, f5. Not only does black have beautiful bishop pair, but look at that space advantage on both the king side and in the center. Knight to c1. Full steam ahead, e4. Look at that d4, e4 pawn duo. This is why we play Dragon Sicilians. After fe, fe, now black even has a half open or completely open f-file to work with, and still has his beautiful pawn duo supported by his bishops and queen. Knight to b3, rook to the c-file, hitting the pawn on c2, rook to c1, and now e3, exclamation point. White hops out with his queen. Notice that trying to use the pin to capture the pawn on e3 fails to rook f1 check, splicing the king and queen. After queen takes, bishop takes, threatening mate on g2, rook takes, and now, with the d-pawn no longer pinned, the rook can safely be captured for a humongous material advantage for black. So after queen g4, bishop to b7, lining up the queen plus bishop battery against the g2 point. Rook over to g1 to defend against queen takes g2 mate, and then, boom, d3. The pawn duo has now advanced to d3 and e3. Black plays c3, but what would have happened if he'd have taken the pawn on d3? Well, you simply trade rooks, weakening black's back rank, and on knight takes, you go queen takes g2, queen sacrifice, and rook f1 mate. After c3, then rook c4, blasting the white queen, queen h5, and then more power chess with rook into f2. A third hit on the g2 square. Queen e8. I guess we could note here that trying to defend would probably just get squished by g4, and then the g2 point is just going to fall. In the game, after rook f2, note that taking the rook simply allows pawn takes, and then both g1 and g2 are feeling the heat. So after the crushing rook f2, white played queen e8 check, but after king h7, decided he was tired of facing this overwhelming, devastating force of the black pieces, and he resigned. Just a superb example by Dr. Lasker of how to use the pawn center, the initiatives, and the bishop pair. The next game in our series of Dragon Sicilians featuring Dr. Emanuel Lasker is against Ostalaza, and this was from Havana, Cuba, 1893. So up to this point, everything's pretty normal. But now, black launches kind of a bayonet attack, if you will, with g4. Well, Dr. Lasker is not going to castle into that, so instead he plays h5, making the pawn declare its intentions. White, playing actively, takes the pawn on h5, and after knight takes, then plays queen up to d2. Dr. Lasker goes in and plays bishop d7, white castles queenside, and rook to c8. f4. Looks like white's doing great. But now, Dr. Lasker plays a nice combination. Bam! Knight takes on f4, taking advantage of the overloaded white bishop on e3. This nets a valuable center pawn. White saves his light-squared bishop with bishop to b5. Now, of course, if he tries to play knight takes on c6, black has knight takes e2 with check. And after the recapture, something like rook takes on c6 with a clear advantage. So after knight takes f4, white played bishop at b5. The knight went back to h5. But black now has a solid extra pawn and a good square on e5 for his knight. Rook at d to f1, bishop takes b5, knight at d takes b5, and here Dr. Lasker plays a little too aggressively. The prudent a6 would have just simply left black a solid pawn up, superb position, and possibilities of knight to c4, collecting the dark squared bishop. Instead, he plays queen a5. And white finds the resource queen d5 giving him counterplay, because now it's too late for a6 because of the shot knight takes d6 with a discovered attack on the unprotected black queen. So after queen d5, Dr. Lasker feels it's probably time to castle. But then, the rook sacrifice, rook takes g6, manages to muddy the waters. Knight takes g6, queen takes h5, and Dr. Lasker is able to play a6, attacking the pinned knight. White uses the time that black spends chasing the knight to execute a rook lift. And after a takes b5, black is a full rook ahead, but after rook h3, white threatens a simple, crude queen h7 checkmate. However, Dr. Lasker, in addition to being a superb in-game player, was an excellent defender. And of course, he plays rook at f to d8, giving his king a little room to run. Queen h7 check, king f8, and now the rook switches back to the f-file. The knight goes back to e5, the rook goes to the g-file, the knight goes back, blocking off the attack, the rook goes back to f3, and now, in order to avoid a draw, Dr. Lasker plays bishop to f6. White plays bishop back to d2, and then comes b4, attacking the knight on c3, which lunges forward to d5, and then queen takes a2 with counterplay. It's black's turn at bat as he threatens queen a1 mate.
Black goes in for bishop h6 check, driving the king to e8, and then the combination rook takes f6. And here, of course, he's hoping that Dr. Lasker will play pawn takes, knight takes check, and at least Black will bounce the king around and have a few checks. But instead, Dr. Lasker returns the favor with the rook sacrifice, rook takes c2 check. The counterattack is in full swing. After king takes, rook to c8 check. And again, think about when we talk about force. In the sector that is now under attack by Black, that is, the white queen side where the king resides, we see a queen, a pawn, and a black rook. For white, all we see is maybe a knight and a pawn, and not too many other pieces even have access in that direction. Maybe you could say, well, the bishop could get back. So in terms of force, in the area around the white king, Black has overwhelming numbers. King to d2, queen takes check, king back, queen check, and now Lasker does everything with check. Check. Now, of course, anywhere along here, he could, if he wanted, I think, just simply pick off the knight on d5, but instead, he goes for rook c2 check and the kill. Black, in fact, got white's resignation after this. After rook c2 check, king d3, the simplest would be something like this. And perfect piece coordination and checkmate. A nice little king hunt. After rook check, bishop d2, you could also just simply play queen takes d5. Black has 4 extra pawns and a pinned bishop and a rook under attack. Tremendous counter-attacking play and a nice tactical shot with knight takes f4 by Dr. Lasker. The last game we're going to look at in our series of dragon defenses by the third world champion, that is the second world champion, Dr. Emanuel Lasker, is a game against Jean Tabenhaus, New York, 1893. Let's take a look. Okay, fairly regular stuff so far. Castles, castles, queen d2, bishop d7, and now f3. Not a real aggressive setup by white, but knight e5, maybe a little premature. Rook c8 might have been better there. Knight to d1, definitely passive. Dr. Lasker, always looking to seize the initiative and counterattack with black, plays d5. Then comes bishop f4. Knight back to c6, putting pressure on the d4 knight. White feels compelled to play e5 and lock up the center. But knight to h5, and you can see the e5 pawn and the f4 bishop are both under pressure. White feels compelled to play knight takes on c6, pawn takes on c6, and then bishop h6. As we said before, very typical way against fianchetto openings for white to try and exchange dark squared bishops. Now today's modern master, playing black, might actually play bishop takes e5, and after bishop f8, queen takes f8, have full compensation for the sacrificed exchange. A beautiful bishop pair, extra pawns in the center, full compensation, I believe. But Dr. Lasker also used a technique that we've seen before. Bishop takes on h6, pulling the white queen into h6 and out of the center. After queen takes h6, now comes queen c7 attacking the pawn on e5. Pawn goes up to f4, supporting e5 and unleashing an attack on the h5 knight. The knight huddles back to g7, which is not normally a great square for a knight, but in this case we know it's just temporary, because after bishop d3, rook b8, b6, and then f6, Dr. Lasker counterattacks the pawn on e5, which was one of his favorite motifs. After e takes f6, rook takes f6, knight to c3, and rook at b to f8, Black has excellent counterplay along the half-open b file. In fact, the pawn on f4 is threatened. Rook at a to e1, hoping to collect the e7 pawn, and then e6. Now, on the surface, this pawn triangle makes the bishop on d7 look bad. However, this is not a permanent situation, as some we've seen. Black has possibilities of c5 or e5, improving the bishop's scope. So after e6, instead of defending the pawn on f4, White played the rook lift, rook to f3, heading over to h3. Black played knight f5, attacking the queen, and after bishop takes f5, took with the rook, again maintaining the pressure on the f4 pawn. Notice now, if the simple g3 to defend the pawn, then rook to h5 could be a very embarrassing moment for the queen on h6. So Black had to decide how to meet rook over to h3. Of course, White has the threat of queen takes h7 mate. But simple enough, rook at 8 to f7, and that keeps or maintains the attack on the f4 pawn, which is now defended by knight to e2, but then, with the queen and rook over here, quote, busy attacking, Lasker strikes at the center. And we can see taking control with the e5, d5 pawn duo. After pawn takes on e5, note that g4, queen check, king g2, and rook dropping back would leave those extended white pawns under a lot of pressure. After f takes e5, Dr. Lasker could have a very nice win here probably with rook takes e5, unleashing an attack on that rook on h3, and if rook e3, rook h5, that's going to hurt. Not only is queen h2 check threatened, but the queen on h6 appears trapped. But in the game after f takes e5, Dr. Lasker played queen b6 check. And on queen e3, the very nice touch, rook takes e5, using the kind of a cross pin, if you will. This forced the trade of queens, queen b6, pawn takes, but now the knight on e2 is pinned. We've entered a 2 rook and bishop versus 2 rook and knight ending. Well, rook to f3, hoping to trade rooks, but pp on the pp. Dr. Lasker doubles rooks on the e-file, putting pressure on the pinned piece. The rook drops back to f2, and then comes bishop to f5, attacking the c2 pawn. When that guy nudges forward, bishop to d3, bringing more heat. Black now has 3 attackers on the pinned knight. The white king has to go to f1 and into another pin. After c5, g3. The question now, of course, white is clearly tied up, but how does black make progress? Well, he pulls the bishop back. Then he advances and creates a passed d-pawn. White seizes the opportunity to shut off the bishop on a6. However, the d-pawn itself becomes another monster in the theme of attacking the pinned piece. Now, white could resign in absolute clear conscience at this moment, but instead played rook f2, and then, after bishop c8, saw that the bishop was going to fly in to h3, gave up the ghost. A beautiful example of counterattack by Dr. Lasker. Our one example of the father of modern Russian chess, Mikhail Botvinnik, playing black in the Accelerated Dragon, is against Vasily Smyslov from the Alekhine Memorial, 1956. Now, Smyslov, of course, sets up the Maroczy bind. Notice that Botvinnik selects the Breyer variation, which will be the focus of our recommended repertoire. So that makes this game interesting not only from a historical point of view, but from an instructional and theoretical point of view. Queen takes, knight takes, queen back to d1, and Botvinnik also plays the e5, anchoring the knight in on d4, variation that we will be recommending in our repertoire section. After bishop d3, d6, castles, castles, rook over, bishop out, a fairly standard position. White retreats the bishop, and now Botvinnik plays very nicely. Rook to b8. After king h1, b5, fighting for the initiative. After pawn takes, queen to d3, soldiers on with b4, knight d5, bishop takes, pawn takes. Now this position is interesting because, yes, white does have the bishop pair. There they are. But black has a superb knight posted on d4, and the white bishop on b1 is kind of out of the action. Plus, the pawn on d5 is actually a bit weak. Let's see how Botvinnik handles this position for black, and it's very instructive for us to keep this in mind. He plays queen a5, immediately targeting the d5 pawn. Well, sad when the queen is the only piece in your camp that can defend a weak, isolated pawn. Rook to b5. A rook lift threatens to capture the pawn. Bishop to d2. White's fighting for his life to maintain material equality. Rook at f to b8. Well, of course, you don't want to play rook d5, bishop takes b4. That gives white a lot of happiness with two queenside passed pawns, and his bishops are going to be able to lurk into freedom. But instead, rook at f to b8 overprotects the b4 pawn in anticipation of collecting the d5 pawn. After queen c8 check, of course, Botvinnik doesn't fall into the mating net with rook takes c8, rook takes, bishop back, and bishop h6 with a rook plus bishop mating net. Instead, after queen c8 check, Botvinnik merely plays bishop f8. After queen d7, the 5th rank rook drops back, and now we can see that the pawn on d5 is a goner. After queen g4, f5. Queen back to h3, and then queen takes d5. Here, black has a clear advantage. He's a solid pawn ahead. He dominates in the center. The white bishop on b1 is out of play. But the reality of the situation is, in a rare technical miscue, Botvinnik actually allowed Smyslov to save a draw in this game. On move 46, the players agreed to a draw. However, at this point, black has a very clear advantage. Beautiful centralization, and excellent strategical play by Mikhail Botvinnik up to this point. Again, the game was a draw in 46 moves, but at this point, black has a plus over minus solid 1-point advantage. Our next world champion, to champion the cause from the black side of the Dragon Sicilian, is not unsurprisingly Botvinnik's most prized student, the 13th world champion, Garry Kasparov. He pulled it out for his match in 1995 on top of the World Trade Center against Viswanathan Anand. Let's take a look. Game 11. Knowing that Anand would be thoroughly prepared, Garry was still willing to enter the Yugoslav variation. After castles, knight e5, rook c8, h5. An interesting point. I believe this is called the Soltis variation, and the idea is kind of like what we saw with the early games from Winower, trying to hold up the advance of the white kingside attack. Well, king to b1, knight to c4. Black has gained the bishop pair. Knight back. Pawn to b5, striving for counterplay. Bishop to h6, looking to trade off the dark squared bishops and weaken the black king position. Then comes queen a5, bishop takes, king takes, and then knight to f4. Rook at f to c8, and black is very active and beautifully lined up along the c-file. Knight at c to d5, Anand looks to trade queens to eliminate some of the pressure, or alleviate some of the pressure. After the queen trade on paired knights, we now have an ending of 2 rooks and bishop against 2 rooks and knight. Probably objectively this ending is close to equal, although I already prefer black by a bit. King back, defending the e7 pawn. Rook over to e1. Rook to the b8. Pawn to b3. Rook back. Knight over. Rook over. And a bit of toggling back and forth, although black does gradually make a little advance on the queen side. King up. Knight in. Bishop here. And b4. Note that if knight takes e7, Kasparov had set a cute little trap. He would play rook over, and when the knight tries to bop out, the pin along the e-file would come into play. But even so, white could have done this and then survived. But he would be equal material. But instead, Anand plays b4 first. And after AB, rook to c4, thinks that he sees a knight fork with knight to b6. And the reason he thought he saw a knight fork was, it is a knight fork. The 2 rooks are clearly under attack. But rook takes b4 check. Now, instead of the knight fork, simple c3, bishop d5, rook d5, rook c3, rook e2 is good enough for equality for white. But after the knight fork, then came rook takes check on b4. And Anand had thought that after king a3, he would be winning because black has 2 rooks under attack. And when Kasparov landed rook takes c2 double exclamation point on him, Anand realized he'd been had. Once you see the move, it's pretty simple. If king takes b4, rook takes d2. And after rook takes c2, if rook takes c2, then rook b3 check. King a2, rook e3, discovered check. And after king b2, rook takes. Black is 2 pawns ahead, and white has no counterplay. So, king a3, rook takes c2. What a shot in a world championship game. And so the Dragon scores a valuable point for Garry Kasparov in what was a tight match. A few days after the round 11 game, Anand showed up for the 13th game of the World Championship match against Garry Kasparov and left his king in the center a little bit too long, and a nifty pawn sacrifice forced him to pay the price. Let's take a look. So pretty much standard fare, Yugoslav attack, Kasparov sticks with the h5 antidote, bishop to b3, rook c8, and here Anand had something new prepared. He trades knights on c6, and then fires in the bishop to h6. Well, Kasparov launches his c-pawn. After bishop c4, then plays queen b6, counterattacking the pawn on b2. Anand trades bishops on g7, and then plays b3, securing the b-pawn. Garry plays the interesting bishop e6. Again, not afraid to trade pieces, after which his king will be more and more secure. Anand playing for some advantage, tries knight to d5. Probably would have been more prudent to simply trade bishops and castle kingside. Garry plays bishop takes d5. And here, white should chase equality. After e takes d5, Garry played e5. And white should castle with a fairly equal game. But instead, after e5, he played d takes e6, looking to give black some weak pawns on e6 and d6. But then, the shocker, d5, exclamation point. Kind of a temporary pawn sack, if you will, because it turns out taking the pawn runs into the pin with rook at f to d8, c4, and then f takes e6, winning the pinned bishop. So after d5, this is a rather cruel setback for Anand, and he had to retreat with bishop to e2. But then, pawn to c4. Kasparov smells blood when the king is in the center, and so he opens up the b6 to g1 diagonal to make sure the white king does not run away. After pawn to c3 to stop the further advance of the c-pawn, he then plays the excellent rook at c to e8. White captures the pawn on c4, but then rook takes e6. Notice, after rook at c to e8, if e takes f7, rook takes f7 is just going to be crushing mobilization of the rooks. So in the game, after c3, rook at c to e8, exclamation point, b takes c4, Kasparov recaptured on e6, pinning the bishop to the king that has stayed in the center a little too long. Well, he tries to rectify the situation by sliding over off the e-file with king to f1. But let's take a look what would have happened if he'd have tried to capture this pawn on d5. Then, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and the very nice touch, queen to b2, attacking the rook and threatening queen takes bishop on e2, checkmate. White clearly has nothing better than trying to escape with castles, but after rook takes e2, white is a pawn up, but black has majors doubled on the 7th rank. Some of the things that might happen, well, for example, if f4, then the rook sack, rook to d8, trying to deflect the queen away from g2. For example, if queen d8, check, check, and mate. So after rook e6, Anand played king f1. But then came rook at f d8. And let's look at the difference, qualitatively speaking, between the black rooks doubled on the e-file, pressuring the bishop, versus the white rooks that are disconnected in the corners and have yet to move. Well, Anand played bishop d3, but then after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, got hit with the hammer blow, knight to e4. After studying the position for a little bit, Anand resigned. The truth of the matter is, his king and queen are just caught in the crosshairs of too much black firepower. Let's take a look at some sample variations. Well, first off, if he tries to trade queens, the simple answer is trade and fork. Okay, after knight e4, you always have to say, well, what would have happened if he'd have taken the piece? But then the fun begins. Rook check, bishop back, rook check, rook takes, and some prime time Kasparov dice and splice. The queen gets separated from the king and clearly lost. One more sample variation. Suppose the queen had gone to e1. Then you have rook to d6, threatening knight e2 check. After pawn takes, then rook check, check, take, take, check, and queen c6. Pretty easy win, as black is completely ripped apart and suffering a material deficit. So what a stunning victory with knight e4. Just think of it, a world championship match where wins with black are rare, and Kasparov won 2 games with the accelerated dragon, easily propelling him to retaining his world championship title. Now we're going to look at 2 games from the current world champion, Magnus Carlsen. In his youth, as we mentioned, the Dragon Sicilian and accelerated Dragon Sicilians were among his big favorites. Here we're looking at the game against Rune Dierhuis, FIDE rating 2483, played in 2004. Magnus at the time was 2552 and would have been about 14 years old. He plays a standard move order, and everything's fairly routine along here. And now white strikes for the initiative with e5. After pawn takes, knight to d7, white continues with the enterprising e6 pawn sacrifice and enjoys a bit of initiative. Pawn takes, bishop g4, and now Magnus trades rooks and plays knight at c to e5, opening the diagonal for his light squared bishop, giving back the pawn with check. Rook d1, black is under a little pressure here. After queen c7, queen e2, rook f8, white errors with bishop to d4. He probably should have considered playing a4 and maintaining a small positional advantage. But instead, after bishop to d4, Magnus strikes out and gets counterplay with pawn to b4. After knight e4, then rook f4. Suddenly the knight on e4 is very fragile. White, still optimistically playing for attack, plays knight to g5. More prudent would have been knight f2. But after knight to g5, Magnus shows no fear and plays h6, putting the boot to the knight and gaining a large advantage. After bishop takes d7, h takes g5. Bishop to e8, and now Magnus played rook e4. But even more exciting would have been knight f3 check. Pawn takes, bishop takes, queen back, and then rook g4 with a crushing attack. However, rook e4 is also quite strong, because after queen f2, then comes rook to g4, and we can see white experiences severe problems on the g2 square. After the obligatory g3, then knight f3 check. In order to avoid nasty discoveries, the king had to slide over to f1, but then came queen c4 check. And after rook d3, bishop takes d4, winning a piece. White could have resigned here, and perhaps if he were playing an older opponent, may have, but struggled on with knight d4, rook d4. Black now has a 5-point advantage. After b3, Magnus could simply retreat the queen with d5 and have a crushing position. But instead, after b3, Magnus showed a little style and went rook takes d3, offering a passive queen sacrifice. After b takes c4, rook d1 check. The nice point being, had the king tried to go to g2, knight to g1 would have been a beautiful check, recouping the queen. Instead, after rook d1 check, the king went back to e2, and then the simple rook d2 check, and rook takes queen allowed Magnus favorable simplification. He now brings his king in for the endgame, White tries one last Hail Mary, hoping to get lucky with a c-pawn, but knight to d4, blockading, king up, pawn up to e5, anchoring the knight in. White tries one last trick, hoping to penetrate on the queen side, but Magnus slams the door shut there, and White, in fact, resigned. A nice game from the 14-year-old Magnus Carlsen, future world champion. Another one of my favorite games in the Dragon Sicilian from Magnus Carlsen's youth was played also in 2004, but this was in Gosdal. Jan Smeets, 25-45 Grandmaster, playing Magnus Carlsen, at the time 25-67. Let's take a look. So, fairly routine moves here in the opening. White plays a bishop e2 classical, and instead of playing d5 going for instant equality, Magnus played d6. After knight back to b3, a6, a4, bishop out. Fairly routine play. Rook c8, queen d2, knight a5. This follows a long, well-known variation in the classical variation of the regular Dragon Sicilian. Knight takes, queen takes, and then bishop f3. Magnus plays his queen into b4, and White overloads on the queen side with rook at f to b1. Magnus chases the bishop pair. Now Black has two bishops, and White has bishop and knight, and more space. After queen d3, Magnus goes for the trade of queens with queen c4. White clamps down on the queen side with a5. Magnus retreats, and now strikes in the center with f5, but then comes knight d5. And here, Magnus trades queens, and then plays rook over. The problem that Black faces here is not only is the e7 pawn under attack, but Black also has to worry about knight to b6, forking the bishop and the rook. After rook at c to e8, rook over, bishop up, knight in. And here the problem of the weak e6 square becomes apparent. Magnus plays rook to c8, and on knight e6, sacrifices the exchange in dynamic style. After pawn takes, knight takes, rook takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes, Black has the bishop pair and one pawn for the exchange. After rook to c1, rook up to f5, attacking the pawn on a5. Rook into c7, and then king e7, protecting the e7 pawn, and meanwhile the pawn on a5 is under attack. Bishop back to d2, keeps an eye on that guy, and then bishop c6, boxing in the rook on c7. White plays rook over to e3, double attacking the pawn on e7, but walking into a pin from the dark squared bishop. However, the c7 rook is still able to take the pawn on e7, but then comes king e8. And after g3 to protect the pawn on f4, then comes the amazing g5. After pawn takes on g5, then comes rook to f3. And that is a pair of bishops. The rook on e3 is in a permanent pin. The king can't get out of the box so easily. I mean, perhaps he could try h4. In the game, he played bishop to c1. But then came bishop c5, bishop back, and then d5, unleashing an attack on the e7 rook. When Black played king up to g2, White played rook takes on e3 exclamation point, and White resigned. After rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, pawn to d4 check would win the bishop on e3. An amazing performance by the 14-year-old Magnus Carlsen.